Let's get into part 2 of the family, leading off with looking at birth rate. Okay, so fathers matter? Yeah, it appears to be. In fact, obviously mothers matter too. I'm not trying to just say fathers only matter, but there's a reason that this is appearing in the research literature, is that the father not being present seems to have a significant impact on a variety of issues, whether that's economic status to health status, and you'll see that in the material I provided. Okay, next question was, has the family size changed, and why does that matter? Well, no doubt the family size has changed. I'm going to draw some connections here between modernity and the changes that have happened in modernity and family size. So I'm looking at birth rate, okay? And you can see birth rate here over time on the x-axis and these different generations as we go along. And you can see that birth rate peak was reached in the middle of the baby boomer generation, and baby boomers around 1947, 1965. What happened here? Why did birth rate then all of a sudden plummet below replacement rate? And replacement is a little bit above 2.0, but in a basic sense, 2.0, right, you're replacing a family. So if a father and a mother have 2 children, they replace themselves, hypothetically, right? So what happened? Well, there's a lot of things that happened from modernity that have likely influenced that rapid drop. Number one is the change in how women were viewed in a family structure. So you had World War II and World War I. Women were in the workforce as a result of men being overseas and fighting or whatever, were fighting in the war, and so you had women enter the workforce. Number two, you had this explosion in wealth post World War II, and this understanding, hey, women might be a good idea to have some women in the workforce. Some of the women never left the workforce, and so that changed potentially birth rate, because women in the workforce, they won't have as many children potentially. This may seem very obscure, but as a result of the technological revolution and the industrial revolution, you have a lot of removal of the tasks that were typically part of household maintenance during the day. So I'll pick one like washing clothes. In the medieval times, how long would it take a woman, which was typically a woman's task, okay, the family structure at the time, to do the laundry? Well, it'd take a long time. You have washing machines now. So now a lot of the tasks that took all day or days now took hours, if even that. Okay. Well, I've helped my wife do the laundry. It seems like it takes forever. But compared to back in the day, if you will, whatever the day is, medieval times, pre-modernity, pre-industrial revolution, pre-technological revolution, those tasks didn't take long. So you had more time available potentially to maybe enter the workforce, is what I'm getting at. Okay. And so we have this well-documented shift as women entering the workforce. Okay. You also had the advent of widely distributed birth control. Okay, this is the first time that birth control could be distributed. That was something that was considered safe and healthy. In 1960, that increase started, right? It appeared on the scene. 1965 became legal for married couples to utilize birth control, and in 1973 it became legal for unmarried individuals to use birth control. Okay, so there was the actual advent of birth control itself, and then there was the thinking that revolved around birth control, whether that's changes in occupation, more time, considered needed away from home, and then just change in the family itself, the view of family. If you even trace, look at the history of one of the significant birth control advocates, Margaret Sanger, right? A lot of her thinking came out of modernity and social Darwinism. Okay, and so we have a lot of things going on during this time, not just just thinking and the mindset change, but you also have the technology that we can maybe accommodate some of these changes in mind to reduce family size. Okay, I'm not arguing that's good or bad. That's just, those are things that happened. You may think of other things that may have happened during that time as well from modernity that affected birth rate. Okay, all right. Obviously, it stayed down on the replacement rate now up until today even. Then again, there's some unique challenges today that, like economical pressures, like inflation right now, student loans, things like that weren't in the baby boomer generation. But this precipitous drop in birth rate is something worth noting and thinking about. All right, so we've established that modernity in one way or another has had an effect on birth rate. Okay, up until our today, up until, I'll say the word modern times, but hopefully now you know what I mean by that. What does this mean? Well, this seems very like an obscure thing, but I'm trying to show even something that may seem obscure. There's effects. Right? Ideas have consequences. Changes in mindset, changes in how we approach things have consequences. I'm not advocating, by the way, that you have to have children if you're a woman. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just presenting data in front of you. Just keep that in mind. I keep saying that. This is not a class about trying to impose an ideology on you. It's just looking at data. I think this is interesting data. All right. So as the Amish study, and the reason I put this study in there again, the Amish study supported this idea that more children, in fact, quite a few children, could increases the longevity of a woman's life, the mother's life. This was a study not in Amish that you can see, not in the Amish, that you can see that the blue line represents no children. So a woman had no children. The green line represents 2 to 3 children, and then the orange line represents 4 or more children. And the referent is 1.0, so that's when they started tracking these women. And then up to roughly around 18, 19, 20 years is where they stopped tracking these groups. So a long follow. You don't see these surveillance studies done very often. I thought it was worth putting in just because anytime you see studies like that, I think they're quite impressive. The research is difficult. But you see the survival rate. So cumulative survival on the y-axis is higher for those with 2 to 3 children. So you can see the curve is still maintained, is higher if you want to think of it that way, without getting deep into the statistics though, but essentially it's higher than that had no children. Okay. But it's also higher than those that have 4 or more children. So seeming to run with the study in the Amish women that having children extends life. This one though seems to say that having 2 to 3 children seems to be the range for optimal health for a woman. What's the difference then? The question we would ask is what's the difference between this study and the study in the Amish? Is there something about the Amish and being a little bit more removed from technology that has brought about this longer lifespan with more children than it? I don't know. This is an interesting thing to explore potentially. But obviously the core issue is more children, longer lives for women. Why? Right? Is there something physiological? Is there something psychological? Both. There's probably a lot of reasons, and I don't know those reasons based on these studies. These are just data. These are things that you can think about. Okay, doesn't mean a woman who has no children won't live a long life. Of course not. Okay, that's not what this data is about. Like making these strong, statements. It is just saying there's a trend. That's interesting when we think about how family sign is reduced. How might that affect the longevity of a woman, of the mother, right? Of a potential mother. Look at the potential benefits of a larger family on health of children. So we're just going to focus on BMI here. This is a table from a study in kindergartners and 8th graders looking at the percent obese and the mean BMI. And you'll see that if we just skip over the number of siblings, that 2 or more siblings as compared to no sibling across the board was significantly lower. And so lower percent obese in kindergartners, lower mean BMI, lower obese in 8th graders, lower mean BMI in 8th graders as well by having 2 or more siblings. You can say the why is maybe less resources, maybe there's more physical activity with more siblings available. Those are all positive things. But when you look at that 22.6, it's still a good BMI in terms of a healthy range. So it's not like these are malnourished individuals as a result of having too many siblings. It just appears that there's a positive effect of having a larger, or more siblings than having no siblings, like an only child, on BMI. Now, that's just one measure. If you look at IQ scores, they tend to be higher in firstborns. So there, you could say there's a negative effect of having a larger family, potentially on intellect. And if we looked at the different, the intellectual dimension of wellness, but we're looking at the physical here, and it appears that there's a positive effect that is happening in these larger families for a variety of reasons. So again, there's a lot of interactions going on. I'm just highlighting some of them and hope that you see some potential interesting connections, even if you don't necessarily buy that a larger family is a good thing. Have some data to support that, right? Have some data to support it the other way too. Maybe a larger family is a good thing. I'm just presenting data in front of you too, as always, to wrestle with and think about. What about marriage and divorce? It doesn't matter. So, how has modernity impacted marriage? So you can see here the x-axis is the years, the y-axis is the divorce and marriage rate. You can see that there's some significant events of obviously Great Depression. This is in the United States history. World War II ends, and you see the baby boomer generation to follow. Marriage rate plummets through the 1960s, kind of when the sexual revolution really takes hold. And in the early 1970s, you see a marriage rate come back up and then start to decline after around 1973, had a little dip, and then decline after, roughly in the mid-1980s. Divorce rate kind of follows a similar trend, not surprising because the more marriages, the more opportunity for divorce. So, you see divorce rate decline, but you've also seen marriage rate decline significantly in the last, 30 years or so, 40 years. So what's at work here? Well, I highlight some of these big dips that occurred You can see the marriage rate decline in the 1960s as part of the sex revolution. There was less, if we think about family structure today, there's obviously a change in mindset about family structure in terms of should a man and woman get married. Well, the answer here is it obviously declined back to the pre-1900 level in terms of marriage rate. Okay, and so you could say, well, modernity maybe had an increase in marriage rate, or at least a lagging increase in marriage rate, and then declined. That'd be a good conjecture. I also think that, again, this is part of the change in mindset, the sexual revolution that occurred, that marriage wasn't as viewed the same as it was in the previous generations, if we're looking at the baby boomer generation. Okay, because you can see even during the World War II generation that marriage rates were higher through the 1900s and 1930s. And then what happened in the second dip? Well, this is the beginning of no-fault divorce. This was something Ronald Reagan instituted. And you can also see the divorce rate increased about that same time. And so, there's been some significant changes that happened politically at the federal government level that may have influenced the family and expectations of family and or the expectations for family longevity. That could be an impact from the federal government itself. Now, you might say, what does it have to do with modernity? Well, if we're thinking that we are modern still, we have this sexual revolution drastically changed how we view marriage, and they can see it today. This particular chart ended in 2010, but you can see this really obvious and significant linear downward decline in marriage since the advent of no-fault divorce too. So now this is more recent modern history, if you want to think of it that way. But you can see the impact, though, of, if we go back to that one of those first figures I showed in this lecture, is how the federal government could impact the family government. Okay, the federal government could impact that. If it's easier to get out of a divorce or to get out of a marriage, then it's less likely people would want to marry, right? And it's less likely that people would see that as a good idea if it wasn't perceived as a long-term thing, right? Now, you can push back on that. You're allowed to. But just wanted to highlight this before we look at some of the statistics of why does it matter. So let's also look at if those that are getting married, how's the mean age changed when somebody gets married, and then how many people are living with a spouse currently. So these two significant lines you see going across from left to right, it goes across the years, of course, and then the one axis, y-axis, says median age at first marriage. Just follow that. It says men and women. If you follow the men and women's lines, you'll see that around 1970, 1980, somewhere in there, 1975, I want to split the difference, you see the curve start to bend up. Okay? And it has a linear increase now. If we follow all the way over to 2018, when this particular data set ended, you see that the average age for a female is over 27, where back in 1930, it was around 21, 22 years old. And you can see the average age for a male is over 29 years old. So this also influenced family size. And the question is, typically it influences family size, but the question is why? Why are individuals marrying later? There could be a lot of reasons for this, okay? Quite a few reasons for this. Some of it could be related to not rushing into marriage because of the concern of divorce. It could be economic pressures. It could be we'll talk about this later, this new change in modern thinking that you have to live your life first before you settle down, right? That's a major mindset shift that has occurred in kind of late modernity here into post-modernity, okay? You also see this the other y-axis says percent. If you follow it, says percent living with spouse. You can see it declines over time. So it's kind of a separate line on this figure. It's kind of confusing if you get the lines mixed up. But if you look at 1970, where it starts, roughly 70% of individuals were living with a spouse, and by 2018, that was down to 50%. Okay, so there's been a change in how we view marriage. So there's no doubt that this change has occurred. That was the first part of that question. So let's look at the connection between health and telomere length. What the heck's a telomere? So telomeres is a kind of a mediator that's been often used in the immune system, but think of it like a candle. If you burn down a candle, right, so many times your cells can split. And so once you run out of candle, the candle goes out. Once you run out of telomere, your cells can't split anymore, and therefore you die. Right? It sounds pretty harsh, but that's just it's a way to assess how much life you have left. Now, you can affect telomere length by behavior. That's the good news. And so this is why telomeres have become interesting to study because they're a simple way of assessing basically your current health status and potentially project how long you're going to live. And if we compare people who are of a certain health status and they have longer telomeres than somebody else, we can say, what are they doing differently? Well, and this becomes the married or not married or married. These are the categories in this particular table I'm looking at in front of you and me. This is married or living with partner, or widowed, divorced, separated, or not married. Those are the two categories. And it's broken down by age, gender, exercise, and social support. All right. And I'll just highlight a few here. If you look at the ages 53 to 64, that was statistically significant. In other words, there was a longer telomere of 1.64 as compared to widowed, divorced, separated, and never married at 1.54. Okay. If you look at genders, both males and females had longer telomeres when they were married versus the other widowed, divorced, separated, and never married. And then among the exercise groups, among the often, very often group, the married had longer telomeres. So if you want to, like, on this table here, optimize everything, you would want to exercise very often and be married, right? Now, again, does that mean somebody who's not married or divorced is not going to live as long as somebody who is? No. But this is a study. This is a snapshot of a population. And I think it's interesting to look at, though, is that when we say, what difference, I'm trying to draw these lines, right, between, okay, marriage has been affected in the last, in particular in the United States, in the last 40, 50 years, there's a decline in marriage. Well, if we have evidence that says, hey, marriage maybe is healthy, what does that mean then in terms of moderns? That if there's less marriage, that maybe there's less telomeres? I don't know. That'd be interesting. This was done in 2011. It'd be interesting to see this study done in 2022. Okay. I'm not drawing straight lines. I'm just trying to draw lines to say these are interesting connections for you to explore and to think about. Okay. And that how we think about marriage and some of these things around us in modernity that have gone on affect marriage, and therefore marriage and the lack of may affect health. Okay. Right. So again, I hope you see these connections, and this is what I want you to mull over and think about. All right. The last thing here, CRP. Okay. If you're not familiar with CRP, think of it as a C-reactive protein. It's a marker of metabolic inflammation or just general systemic inflammation. And it's not a good thing. So you want lower CRP. All right. And this table is from another study that looked at, and really, I'll arrive at the conclusion here, but you can look at the numbers briefly here. Mean CRP levels, you'll see married men, married women, and unmarried women. And you can just see in a general trend, like the married men had 2.16 CRP, lower is better, versus 2.72, married women 2.61 versus unmarried 2.79. And the crux of the study, the big information out of this study is that married men had lower CRP levels compared to all the groups. Okay. And if there was a referent used of a non-smoker, exerciser's normal BMI, a married man, like would the CRP levels anyway, were equal to that man. Okay. So in other words, marriage for men in this study was significant in terms of health status as defined by CRP. Okay. Now this is very narrow in the sense we have to just focus. It's only CRP, only in this population. But at least if we just focus, and we said if we thought CRP was really a valid measurement of systemic inflammation, which leads to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and other things, it would appear that marriage provides a significant protection physically for men, even more so than women. Okay? Even more so than women. So, again, just some interesting studies as we look at these connections between even just something, marriage itself may have a protective effect in many ways on health. Okay? And we could, if you wanted to take this a different direction, you say, why? What is it about it? Well, it could be a lot of lower stress, right? You provide stresses, you have somebody to talk to. I'm highlight that in lectures ahead, is that even in nutrition, it may be the person in front of you that is more important in that nutrition than the actual food itself, right? Maybe. Doesn't mean the food doesn't matter, but, the human interaction is a big deal. I think as human beings, we know that, how important that is. And we just went through a time with COVID that I think highlighted that more than ever, right? That human interaction is a powerful effect on health, powerful effect on health. And there may be something about marriage itself that, whether that is the feeling that you're locked in with this person, and it's for life and all those type of things, and maybe you have more investment emotionally in that. I don't know. Those are things that these studies don't answer, and I won't attempt to. I'm not an expert in these fields, but I'm looking at the data and looking at modernity, and we're trying to look at these general trends as a result of this data. All right. Hopefully, you've again, you're seeing some things here, that connections and maybe drawing lines, and look in the research yourself too. And maybe you find studies that are counter to this. That would be interesting to explore as well. Bring them to my attention. I like to read research literature, obviously, or I wouldn't be a professor. So I like looking at these connections as well. Again, I hope you find value in the course, and I see you guys in the next lecture.